So a brief thumbnail sketch for what Argus Insights does. We're a social capital accounting firm, which is why I'm the only person in the room wearing a tie, which let me remedy that right now. Basically, we go around and help companies understand, observe, and interpret what's going on in the marketplace by pulling data from multiple sources of social insights. So we're not just sitting at stream. We didn't just deliver 2.5 million data points to Kristi and Ed and say, have fun. We filtered on keywords. We really dove into it. We did kind of a forensic analysis on what's in the depth of what's going on. And we use that to help understand and develop and measure true metrics of social capital. We find our measures are actually predictive analytics of future sales volume in some cases. But that's not what we did for BSSP. We actually dove deep to understand how these brands were using social media and how the brand advocates and the customers were using it, talking about the brands to figure out who was driving the bus in the conversation, the brand or the market. And what we found was everyone's running to these channels of communication. They're falling over backwards to be the ones who occupy the most point of view and the most hits and the most retweets within these categories. There's tons of money going in the space, but what we're also finding is that people are stumbling over themselves. Some brands get it, some brands don't. They're trying to treat it as leveraging models of interaction that they know from other things. But we found that examples of good and bad and ugly we're going to share today based on the information from that. And a lot of it, the ugly comes from not understanding what their current balance of social capital is in the marketplace today. And so that's a lot we're going to talk about is the framework that we've developed together to help brands understand the right way to, how do you start off on the right foot? You don't show up to a gunfight with a toothpick. And so when you come through and actually have the impacts that you want, you have a better chance up front. So pass it back to Ed.
Okay. So ultimately, this is all about storytelling and conversation, and we believe that we are entering this age of conversation, and how we can help brands is really in these 4 ways. If you can define the role you're going to play in the conversation, that really helps. So it's back to basic strategy here. What type of conversation do you want to have? What are you looking to do? What are you looking to achieve? What we've noticed is that it's a free-for-all out there. I mean, basically every single division and department of marketing wants in on social media. So you got the promotions guys who want a quick promotion hit. You got HR looking to recruit people. You got PR looking to improve the corporate image, all through these single channels. There's not a bifurcation of channels. It's not like the HR guys can just talk quietly to sort of HR Weekly and get their message out. They're all doing it through these same mass channels. So without a strategy and without a point of view, it can be particularly confusing. What's the extendability of your social capital and brand voice? It's not like any brand can just jump on board and start playing. It's almost like you need to know what you have, what assets you have in your armory to basically move forward through that conversation. If you extend your brand and start talking about things that you have no right talking about, consumers will be scratching their heads and wondering what the hell it is you're doing. So I think it's smart to understand where you're coming from, and that helps you understand where you can go. So you ultimately end up with kind of new rule sets for engaging conversations. So what I'm going to do now is hand you over to Kristi and John, who are really going to take you through our rule set, what we found out there as the conversational models, show you some examples, show you some data, and then at the end kind of sum it all up and wrap it up with a process we believe brands can employ to deliver effective conversations.
So as we entered into this research project, in full disclosure, I'll tell you, we were on a little bit of a fishing expedition as we set out. We weren't exactly sure what we were going to find, but we used the 4 kind of key areas that Ed just outlined to really guide what we were looking for as we saw and parsed through those 2.4 million pieces of data, and then we really let that story emerge. So I felt really good listening to the earlier speakers say that you didn't have to set out on the journey knowing the exact story that you were going to tell, but you needed to be able to recognize the components of it as it started to unfold. And so I think that's really what we did here with this research project. So we'll take you through a couple of different levels of a framework that we've established, and hopefully that will at the end kind of help you understand the complete framework that we've developed. But the first one really focuses in on these various conversation roles that we saw brands playing today. And it's interesting. Brands are showing up in wildly different ways, and even differently as a brand in the way that they articulate their brand voice at various times or within certain conversations or on different platforms. We saw a wide variability. But it's interesting because we saw actually some of these roles almost become like people that we might know at a party, or the people that you interact with, or you're kind of like hey, I know that guy. I know how they show up consistently. And so we started to almost develop these archetypes that we saw. And so we're going to take you through several examples of these, and then go into some more detailed examples with some of the specific brand cases. But really what we saw was this spectrum emerge where there were certain types that definitely were driving much higher engagement from the consumer perspective. There were some in the middle, maybe less emotional, maybe much more rational, more promotional driven, and that's okay. It was fine if that's what the brand was intending to do. And then there were others that maybe weren't quite as aware of how they were being perceived or how the consumer was actually taking them in, and weren't driving the level of engagement that I assume they probably would have hoped to have been driving. So we have these archetypes, and one of the things that we thought would be really fun is to actually use some cartoons. And so Harry Bliss actually worked with us on this, and so we've got a series of cartoons to help explain these archetypes that are pretty fun. And I think you'll recognize, like I said, some of these kind of characters that maybe you've met at a party or from work or whatever. So the first one is this entertainer, and the entertainer is just someone who consistently tells a great story. Draws a crowd, people want to listen to them. It's someone you're looking for when you enter into the room, right? It's someone you feel comfortable with, and you know that you're always going to enjoy speaking to. And so there are brands out there that are doing a really good job of entertaining, and that is definitely a very viable way to engage consumers, and they're doing it very well. The second is the intentional planner. And I think of this as my next door neighbor, who no matter what, she knows and has everything just tied up perfectly. She's kind of the Martha Stewart, incarnate. I constantly feel like I'm not delivering at the level that, she's delivering no matter what it is. It's that person you love to hate because they're so buttoned up and they're so consistent. They deliver it time and time again. They're very smart, and you can really see intentionally what they are doing and how that's coming across. And so they're brands that are really good. They're out there, they're delivering their brand voice in a very consistent way. Consumers are responding, they're highly engaging, but they're very, very thoughtful in terms of what they are doing and why. The next, this is not who we want to be, right? When you're at a party, this is the egoist. And, this is just the brand that is really all about the brand. And they're out there and they're talking about themselves and they've got something to say. They don't really care if the consumer wants to hear it or if it's relevant to the consumer, but they're just going to talk about it because they're the brand and, they're convinced that everyone wants to hear what they have to say. So they're not listening. And this is an example of where consumers are relatively very unengaged. Because it's just the brand talking about the brand. And then the next one is the counselor. I think this is a pretty common type, right? We know that social media is being used by a lot of consumers to solve problems. And so you see a lot of brands showing up. You know what, I'm very sorry you had that poor experience. Here's something we can do, or I'm sorry this product's not working for you. Here's the remedy for that, try this. And it's really just that brand showing up in a way that allows them to have that dialogue when the consumer is looking for some help and they're solving a problem for them. And so this is very valuable to a lot of consumers, and it's a very relevant way and a relevant role for brands to play in social media. And then the last one I'm going to highlight now, and we'll go into some more in a minute, but is the wallflower. And believe it or not, there are actually quite a few brands out there that just aren't participating, right? I mean, consumers are talking about them. You see these gaping opportunities for them to enter into the conversation, and they just sit back, right? They're not engaging. They might be listening. We aren't really sure if they're listening, but they're not a part of it at all. And so a real opportunity for quite a few brands to actually think about engaging versus just listening and not being a part of the conversation. So, as we looked at this kind of on the macro level and we started to identify these different roles in conversation, there were a couple of, key takeaways and I think some implications that we wanted to keep in mind as we move forward and dug a little bit deeper into the development of this framework. And we've covered a lot here on the first point about the brand needing to understand the role that they're playing in conversation. And we think if we start to identify some of these archetypes and the ways that brands are entering, you can be more planful in terms of saying, this is how, as a brand, we want to enter that conversation. This is the type of role that we want to play. The next piece, and we'll go into this in more detail now, but I think sometimes we forget and we come at it from that brand lens and we talk about the consumer, but do we always think about the expectation that the consumer has around the value that they get? So if you're asking them to give you your time, there's a return there that's expected by the consumer. And so how are the brands delivering on that expected value in the conversation that's relevant to the consumers and why they would want to continue to engage with you? So that's an important piece we'll talk about as well. The third piece here is around the type of conversation. And so we're going to break this down into three main types of conversation in the model around promotion, propaganda, and participation. And again, it's, I think, a tool that you can start to use by aligning your objectives and what you're trying to accomplish by initiating the conversation with then how you actually show up in the conversation. And the final point, and John talked a lot about this, and I think Ed spoke to it a little bit earlier as well, is this notion of social capital and your brand voice. And there's a lot here about what is the extendability of your brand and what you actually are able to do today. So if you decide you want to be, one conversation role type, but your brand has no equity in being able to do that, that might not be the best play. So you need to assess and start from that position of who are we as a brand today, where are we credible, and how can we extend into the conversation so that you're getting off on a good foot. So here's the overall framework. We're not going to speak to all of this today. It's fairly robust and complicated here as you look at this graphic, but we're really going to focus in on the middle three slices there around promotion, propaganda, and participation, and take you through several examples of brands and what they were doing in those spaces. So the first is promotion. And just to set this up a little bit, this is really when we talk about the conversation type, right? We all know, I think everyone here is very familiar, we don't need to go too deeply into what a promotion means, but really what I'd like to call out here is from a brand standpoint, it's about driving market share, right? It's really about something that's designed to drive that immediate engagement right now and capture that consumer engagement in the moment, probably in a way that is timed or focused within a certain duration, right? So we have an intent, there's a promotion, it's going to be a week long, and we want to have a certain result at the end. So there's kind of a beginning and an end to it in terms of how we enter into this conversation. From a consumer perspective, what makes it more likely for them to engage is when you're actually fulfilling on that need for them, right? So they have an immediate need, and they're seeing that need fulfilled within the promotion that you're serving to them kind of at that right moment. So oftentimes it could be that they're looking for a deal. It might be that need to a resolution, a service resolution, or something that kind of an immediate service they're looking for. But the key thing here is that this is easy for them. It's easy for them to engage, they're in and they're out, and it's not about necessarily developing a long conversation, but you're there when they need you to be there and you've delivered something back to them. So one of the first examples we're going to talk about is the connector. And the connector is a brand that shows up in a way that actually identifies something that's happening in pop culture and is able to relate that back to the brand. So if you think about it, it's not necessarily that the brand is at the center of the conversation, it's the brand borrowing some of the equity from something that's happening outside of the brand and connecting it to it in order to start the conversation with the consumer.
So the example from that, lots of different things we could pull from, but one of the key ones we found was really interesting was Wendy's. During the study period, Lent happened. And what we found was that within the Wendy's brand stream, consumers were talking about, hey, let's go get a fish sandwich at Wendy's on Friday. And Wendy's picked up on that. They were listening. They were following what's going on and actually started this whole promotional campaign, come get a fish sandwich and show us your best fish face. And you know what I mean by fish face. If you have kids or you were a kid, which you all were at one time, you made a fishy face. And so this whole response was a way to take a meme that they had seen come out of the brand conversations that are already taking place just between consumers. And then they turned that into a promotion campaign that brought people into the restaurants for that observation of the Lenten holiday. And so this wasn't a predefined campaign. This was listening. This was really connecting to what was going on and listening to the consumers and how did they insert themselves in the conversation. Think about the party goers that you see that do that well at cocktail parties and those that don't. Wendy's did it well here.
Great. So the next role that we're going to talk about in terms of promotion is this notion of being the cult of personality. And really what this is about is a shared value set. So a brand showing up and having a message and a voice that is built around a shared value with the consumer. And so it's something that the consumer wants to be a part of, and they're looking for the brand to be very consistent in the way that they deliver that as well. So I love this one, just Lotus Airways, right? A green airline genius, has to have a yoga practice. I'm shaving my head tonight. I mean, it's the brand at the center and the consumer wanting to be a part of that.
So the example here actually is Subway. This is an overnight success over a decade in the making. We all remember the Jared campaigns and how Jared lost insane amounts of weight eating just Subway. That was one of those things where Subway was listening before there was social media to what their customers were actually doing. This showed up in the data here with their February campaign. They were able to leverage that existing brand capital and that cult around Subway as healthy to drive this February campaign, which any foot long for $5 in the month of February. Someone was really in love with alliteration at Subway. That was a lot of different Fs. But we saw basically, especially early in the month, big peaks around that, but continued throughout. This was a continued part of the brand conversation throughout the entire month as a promotion. And what we saw in the data was actually evidence of people using this as a reason to go back to Subway if they hadn't been in a while. This actually drove conversions, which is an important piece to kind of pull out of this mix. How do you leverage that with a cult of personality? That gives you certain kind of license to engage your customers and your brand loyalists around that.
So the next piece of this is what we call propaganda. And propaganda is really about the brand capturing mind share. So we've moved from market share, from a promotional perspective, to now we're trying to develop a deeper relationship with the consumer and really start to capture the mind share of that consumer. This is really, I think, when we think of a lot of the traditional campaigns, marketing campaigns, advertising campaigns that we, have seen over the years, this feels like the sweet spot for that. One of the interesting things, however, is that we definitely saw a linkage between the novelty and the stickiness and kind of how that drove the engagement of the consumer in this space. So the more novel, the more sticky it became. From a consumer perspective, it's about experiencing the brand. I mean, this is really where they are trying to assess whether or not the brand reflects them, whether or not they want to be a part of that, whether they want to engage in that conversation. And it's the starting point of a dialogue, potentially, right? So promotion is much more of a push from the brand out to the consumer. They can enter into that conversation themselves, but this is really more about a dialogue. And the consumer is also looking to judge the consistency. So consistency is very important as we get into successful propaganda conversations. And I think the thing to note, and this goes back to what Ed said earlier, this is starting to get really difficult because the experience value of what the consumer needs to take away really has to outweigh all of the other competition or competitors for their mind share. And so, that's just another element that I think as we move forward, this is going to become harder and harder to do because there's just so much more out there for people to consume and decide what they want to be a part of. So this is an example how we saw a lot of brands show up, and it's this notion of the firecracker, right? And again, very successful in some cases. It doesn't have to be about creating a long conversation, but they did something really amazing or really interesting, and they did it in a really quick flash, and they were gone. And they drove a ton of engagement, and then they moved on to the next campaign. And so I think, this is also very interesting because I think it indicated to us that brands can show up in lots of different ways, and they can have lots of different roles in these conversations, and it might be okay to be kind of this quick flash if that serves your strategic intent. And so there's an example, I think, of a brand that did this very well.
So for this, actually went to Old Spice. You've seen the campaigns. And you've probably seen the shift that happened over the turn of the year in which they made Terry Crews their spokesperson and went from a message of swagger to a message of power, right? You remember those campaigns? in the commercials where they show up in the bounce ads and things like that. I never thought that deodorant and fabric softener would go so well together. And huge amounts. And so what you see there is kind of the baseline is the conversation that Terry Crews is driving within the Old Spice stream. And it's pretty consistent. You get peaks and valleys when new commercials come out, but there's a lot of conversation around that. That peak right there came from 140 characters on February 13th. They brought back Old Spice Man for a cameo. Nothing says I love you like an armpit that smells like an armpit wearing Old Spice inside of a tuxedo on a battleship with a mariachi band to serenade you. One tweet shared across like crazy. The hyperbole message made sense. They couldn't have done that unless they'd done all the other Old Spice Man, promotions for the past couple of years. But that firecracker ignited a huge kind of conversation within the sphere around the message of love and what it means to show your love by wearing Old Spice, which is very different than Axe, and we can talk about that in the break. And speaking of love, the great thing about the month of February is there's all these love campaigns, and we love to talk about the love campaigns because they're lovely. Who here has ever dipped fries inside of a Frosty? Oh, yes, you're out there. This was a unrepresented niche in the marketplace. There's actually a Frosty fan page in which people post their own gastro porn of fries enveloped in chocolate goodness. And Wendy's knows this, and they started a campaign basically where now there's this stream of consciousness in which people are talking about this, and the people who don't know the goodness of this combination puzzle, and you see this like, what? Happening in Twitter. But what you see in this is that they leveraged it. Wendy's had this, starting February 2nd, this whole Fries Loves Wendy's campaign in which Fries and Frosties were giving each other massively hyperbolic, English is not my first language, I grew up in Arkansas, hyperbolic gifts in which Fries gave Frosty a greater than lifestyle solid chocolate sculpture. And it culminated with Frosty giving Fries the entire surface of Venus carved in their image. It drove a huge amount within, though, and you know who you are, you all raised your hands. For people who love that combination, it's like, yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. They were able to leverage that niche in a kind of firecracker kind of a way with this hyperbole, which firecrackers only work if it's in an environment that it's willing to take place. The biggest bang happened in the right places. You put a fire cannon, some of you know this because you did this when you were kids, put a firecracker inside of a small spot, nothing happens, like, poof. You put it in a spot where there's echoes and like an auditorium, something like that, and bam! That's what Wendy's did here.
So the third P, we call these the 3 Ps. The third P is really about participation. So we're kind of we're moving down that scale here in terms of engagement, and this is about timeshare. This is about the brand really getting the consumer's attention, engagement, and the consumer investing back into the brand in a way that they are willing to actually give up their time. They might start to curate content on the behalf of the brand. They might create content. They are about co-creating that experience with the brand. And so, this I think is very aspirational for a lot of brands. I think we saw campaigns, again, that try to go right to this notion of participation, but didn't have the foundation and the relationship with their consumer to enable the right way to go here. And so I think this is a bit aspirational, but there are brands that have that right away and are doing it very well today. We really saw this focus on this split between this fun activity and the brand experience. So these experiences were built around, again, oftentimes giving the tools to the consumers to create something that they would enjoy. That was a part of a niche, a niche interest that they had, or something that they really engaged in. And maybe, again, the brand was listening and understood what that was and then carried that forward in new ways for the consumers to experience the brand. This is about the consumer expressing that relationship. I mean, this is really starting to turn over the control of the brand to the consumer, and that can be very scary for a lot of brands. But I think what we're going to see is more and more of a consumer and a growing consumer expectation to take more ownership over the brands that they are connecting very deeply with and that they have this emotional relevance with. because they want to start to evangelize this to other people. And that's the big piece of this. It becomes about sharing. It becomes social network as a way for them to share their experience or their love of this brand. So one interesting role here that we saw was this zeitgeist. And, you know, this is really about a brand seeing something that is happening kind of real time and finding a way to connect to that in a real time way. And I think what it does here is because it connects, it actually makes that a much richer engagement for the consumer because it's connecting to something more relevant outside of the brand within culture.
So the first example here actually came from Kraft Foods for the macaroni and cheese. Some of you may recognize Ted Williams, the Golden Pipes of Love. This is a guy who was homeless and was recognized by one of the editors of Entertainment Tonight. It was in the Today Show, et cetera. And you think about the key demographics that watch a lot of Entertainment Tonight and Today Show. There are also the key demographics for Kraft mac and cheese in terms of prep and things of that sort. So they were able to leverage this in a participation campaign in which they asked people to tweet to the voice of love their own love notes around Valentine's Day. And then, so consumers are asked to participate and share, and those that were picked, Ted read, they made a YouTube video, sent that back out in the group, and that kind of retweeted again. So you know this kind of cascading effect of multiple engagements through that, in which everyone submitted trying to think, can my Valentine wish to my special someone be read by Ted? And then, oh, it did, let me tell everyone about it. So you end up with this wonderful kind of intention viral effect that goes out with it. Now, it was a point in time. It was around Valentine's Day. And you're not going to get Ted to do this, you know, every day for the next 25 years either. It loses its novelty. So they were good about how they framed it. But it was powerful. It was a huge part of what was going on, and a lot of discussion within the traffic around Kraft and mac and cheese around this campaign. People were sharing their love and affiliated Kraft with that love. So it was a great alignment with their own brand, but a great way to get customers not just to go out and buy mac and cheese, yay, pasta and dairy, but to actually go out and really engage and participate and create with the brand their own stories. Oh, the second one. This went over started off in January with a kickoff event actually here in New York where people were designing T-shirts in, I think, Times Square or Central Park or something. I don't know. Effectively, Wendy said, make a T-shirt. People were like, what does T-shirts have to do with hamburgers? They gave them a limited palette. There was a Facebook app that put together so you could actually put together hot and juicy and where's the beef and all these kinds of things, and then send it out to your friends for voting. It was wonderful because it was social voting, it was engagement, there were prizes involved, and then once the T-shirts are available, all the proceeds go to a nonprofit. Wendy's amped it up even more by inviting celebrities to engage in this. Trey Songz was the most influential in terms of, as he was talking about his engagement with this contest and cause, it went out through the social sphere in great ways. So they knew how to target celebrities and heroes in different demographics to extend the reach of this campaign. And over the month, huge amounts, thousands of entries, and then tens to hundreds of thousands of people going and sharing and voting on the different T-shirts. And who knows how many different views. It was fun. And Wendy's was really good about how they used the streams across Twitter and Facebook to find people where they were and to engage them in the way that they wanted to be engaged with. It was a wonderful participation campaign.